So I'm a traditional English leather worker, and I trained as a saddler in Walsall in the West Midlands. My grandfather was a leather gilder. He would always, give us presents that had our initials or our name in gold leaf. That was his job. I've grown up with leather. Invariably, traditional English leather comes from saddlery or military. As I trained as a saddler, then the influences show on my design. What I'm aiming for these designs is that there are as few processes as possible between the leather on my bench and its source. The leather that I love to use comes from Devon. It's the last oak bark tannery in Europe. To transform these Devon cowhides to leather, all that is used is water from the River Collie that flows beside the tannery, and oak bark from Owen Jones in the Lake District. He coppices it, it comes to the tannery, and the only other ingredient that they use, that they need, is time. It takes almost 2 years to process these hides. The leather that I use has got scars, blemishes, imperfections. It's full grain. It's the surface of the animal's skin, so the animal lived its life, in the case of the deer, a wildlife. Sometimes I would use that as a feature. And in fact, once I did make one of my messenger bags and put the scar right on the front. And it so happened that that bag was taken to the Paris fashion show and photographed by Vogue Italia. This great big scar right across the front. When I work with the oak bark tanned leather, it's a very special leather. So I want to reserve my very best techniques. They've been used, for generations and generations. The techniques of edging, thinning down the skin, or we call it skiving, edge dyeing, and not forgetting hand stitching. The belts are hand stitched, the bags are hand stitched. So they're very special. You only need to look at a Tanner Bates oak bark belt or a messenger bag just to see, wow, this is something extraordinary. We use traditional hand tools. The round knife has got to be my favourite tool. It's a great tool. The reason it's good is because you can use it to do very kind of intricate, tight curves, or if you roll it forward and push it through the leather, it gives you long, straight edges. I have a relationship with the makers. I know who makes my leather. I know him by name. I see him regularly. I know the man who makes my buckles in the foundry in Walsall, where they cast these buckles in sand. His name's Barry. That, for me, is very important. We use a beeswax preparation on the edges of the belt. And you know what? I even know the bees that provide that beeswax. The brief that I was given by the Devon Guild of Craftsmen was to create something with a sense of place. First of all, it was the decision, well, what am I going to make? And then the inspiration came, you've got to make a football. It was quite difficult to work out the pattern. There didn't seem to be any living person with experience of hand-stitching footballs that I could find. I had to work it out by looking at an old ball or picture, and then luckily the German Football Museum sent me an old football. Thinking about what leather am I going to use, the Devon oak bark tanned leather was my first choice. But then when I tried to apply that, it didn't really work. So I was looking around the workshop, and then my eyes fell upon this deerskin that was brought into me last year. It's got to be local roadkill, home tanned deerskin. It's not a particularly pleasurable experience, skinning, but I know, looking into the future, that what I can create from this rather gory experience is something to be admired.
It's hugely important I'm working in the city that I live. It's an urban environment because of the textile heritage of the area. There's so much evidence of the textile history of the place, from looking down the canal just down the road and seeing this line of mill chimneys. My dye bed that I keep at my allotment has a real variety of plants in it that do produce something that I can use with my textiles. I grow a range of plants that are connected to colour production but also fibre production, and I grow some what would be classed as very traditional dye plants, things like woad, things like indigo, madder, weld, So these are ancient dyes. They're all quite exciting in different ways. I do think there's a bit of a wow factor with any plant that can do multiple things, things that are medicinal, things that are culinary, is to kind of understand just how much there is to the things that grow around us and how many uses that we would historically have had for them and how many uses we can have for them today. I'm very fond of madder, Rubia tinctoria, which is a red dye. Like quite a lot of dye plants, it looks insignificant as a garden plant. It's got a kind of sprawling habit. The colour is actually all in the roots, and it's a very slow process to actually achieve colour from those roots. You have to really leave the plant in the ground for a good sort of 2 years to get a good strong red from it. It's such a vibrant red, it produces this colour that I feel is really alive. I'm not trying to use traditional processes in the traditional way, but I am very interested in where things come from. And also, these skills are really great tools for engagement. Just the use of colour as a subject. Dyer's chamomile, it is a variety of chamomile. It's a particularly strong colour. It's all yellow, the whole flower head, whereas most chamomile plants would have like white petals. It is something that I grow specifically for dyeing, and it has a very strong characteristic fragrance. It makes a very beautiful sunny yellow, and so many dye plants produce yellows, and I do particularly like that one. It's a good yellow. I prepare my fabrics or my threads before I dye with them. This process is called mordanting. The word mordant means to bite, and what the mordant does is it creates a bridge between the fibre and the colour, and it means that they kind of bond together. I also use found metal, basically things like rusty nails, stuff that I dig up at my allotment. I make an iron-rich liquid which I use to darken the colours in my dye baths. So the traditional word for that would be to sadden your dyes. It just means it just knocks it back a few shades. I'm particularly interested in the edges of things. Rather than dye whole pieces of cloth, I'm just kind of starting off by letting the dye absorb up through the fibres of the cloth and letting it do it in its own time. I stick to natural fibres, so most of the things I'm currently working with are wool based. It's a big nod to the textile heritage of Bradford as a wool city, which was known as Worcesterdopolis in the 19th century. I hand stitch, that is what I do. I really like the process. It's a very reflective process for me. It is actually something that I can do alongside people as well. It is a portable way of working. I can kind of have my hand stitching out on the kitchen table and be present in family life at the same time. I don't have to kind of have loads of equipment. It's a simple way of working. I like simple stitches and I like the repetitive nature of that. And I kind of feel that because my threads and my fibres are all coming from the same sort of colour place, it's embedding that place in the work really. Making the connections between the place and the way that I work has been strengthened since I lived here. Understanding the heritage of this area and provenance of the materials has been really important to me.
Middleport Pottery. It's very dear to my heart, that place. It's one of the last remaining Victorian factories in the city. The pull for me for the building is the fact that it's a traditional ceramics factory and it uses clay which comes in at one end raw and goes out the other end as a fired and finished product. All the processes in between are just absolutely fascinating because it's about the human relationship between the clay and people's hands. They say it takes 25 pairs of hands to produce one piece of work before it gets the final product that's sold on the shelf. The way they decorate is they use paper transfers on the work, and it's the only factory in the world that does it in that way, so it's a very unique process, but that's been passed down through generations of people in Stoke. It's kind of in people's blood. When Prince Charles put that money into doing the factory up, I was commissioned to make an architectural model of the factory as it was in 1880. The main challenges for doing that piece of work was the scaling of the buildings. Each individual building had to be made, fired and then joined together, so the shrinkage rate is crucial to get right. I'm very passionate about Stoke and its people. I just think it's a very unique place in the country. One, it was the birthplace of British ceramics, and two, it's still the major manufacturer of ceramics throughout the UK. That's the reason why Stoke City are called the Potters. If you can imagine, there was maybe 300 different ceramics manufacturers in the city over the years. Ceramic detritus and ceramic shards are basically everywhere underneath this city. I'm a bit like a detritus magpie where I just fly around and I collect all sorts of unbelievably amazing objects. I never quite know where they're going to end up. The work is about archaeological heritage. I mean, I call it sculptural archaeology as well. It all started for me when I was like a 12-year-old boy when I lived in Harrogate in North Yorkshire. I used to dig on an old Victorian rubbish dump. A lot of my ancestors used to live in that place, so in a sense it was like digging up my ancestors' past. That's what I'm doing in Stoke as well, really, is reconnecting with the past and celebrating the future of Stoke. As an individual maker, it's not like working in a factory where you have a certain skill level and you get very good at that particular thing and you do that thing all your life. As an individual ceramic maker, you have to do everything from conceiving the ideas to making the work and designing the work and firing the work and doing the mould making and mixing your own clay and glazes and colours and all the other processes in between. It's a complicated life, but an interesting one. A lot of it's got three-dimensional content in it, so it's not just a complete flat surface, so it's actually semi-three-dimensionally modelled. So if it's got a human head, it actually physically looks like a human head. I have to sit down and model those in clay to start with. Then I take a cast of that object and then I can reproduce that object time and time again. But having said that, every single object is all hand coloured and hand painted. Modelling is so time consuming, it takes a long time to model anything really. But of course I also take a lot of casts from objects that I find. I might find a Bakelite baby's dummy from the 1950s, pre-plastic, and I think that's an amazing object. I'm going to change that into clay. So it's changing its whole personality as a material from one material to another, and I do that all the time with things that I see. I never quite know what it's going to be, but all those things eventually go back into the work. I'm not just purely a maker, I'm a maker of ideas and philosophy and ethos. There's messages in the work, and every single piece of work I do has got different motivation for being made and different subject matter. For me, that's really important. I never quite know what I'm going to do next, but because a lot of the work is related to political events or historical events or wars or all sorts of different climatic changes, whatever the subject matter is, I will deal with it. So in a sense, I'm making stuff which relates to the things I'm interested in, but I'm also mixing it in with ancient objects as well to give it even more kind of relevance and meaning.
It's exciting because this is a pocket of extreme natural beauty. It is really quite a magical place that when people know about it, they come back very regularly. I really love nature and I want that to be really important in my work. I really like the quite romantic English woodland idea. I do romanticise the forest as a den, as a safe place to hide away. On the footpath of any walk, there's lots of materials that are completely overlooked and will get destroyed if not picked up. So I started collecting those materials and bringing them home and then thinking about what I could use them for. The materials that I use are completely based on what is available nearby. Having the woods on your doorstep, every day you're walking in the same place and it changes so dramatically and it's beautiful all the way through the year. It's really exciting when you walk and you suddenly notice, the first leaves coming out, the first snowdrops, the first bluebells. There's always a first all the time. Things do definitely catch your eye. At the moment in the winter, it's perhaps the shapes of the branches of the trees. It's almost like looking for something that isn't typical of nature, like maybe a quirky stick or a stone. I'm interested in the bits that could easily get overlooked and destroyed and trodden on. It is really about bringing the outside in and being able to enjoy the feeling of being in the woodlands, even though you're in your front room. People use bark because maybe that's all there was and they had to use it. And now we've got the luxury of thinking, well, we can still use it if we want to, we've got other choices. But bark is still there. It's so trusty and loyal. It's really strong, so it lasts forever. It's got some special resinous oils in it so that it never decays once it's kept inside and dry. It's just an amazing material. So once I'd started using it, nothing else quite replaces it really. I always gather the materials first and then think about what I might do with them later. The best thing is to just collect the things that you really love and then just live with them and listen to them for a while. I love sycamore seeds, and I know I'm not alone about that because so many people get really excited when they see that you've used the sycamore helicopter wings. I spend a lot of time sanding down the bases of acorn cups. I really love the stitching together, so I never use glue. I did dabble with staples once, but I got over that. It's very, very fiddly, and a lot of the time it doesn't work. I have to start again or get fresh materials. Tying knots is so satisfying. I worked my way through a whole book. I think everybody should have about 10 knots that they're really comfortable doing. It'll impress people enormously. So I love knotting and just different ways of binding things together, but also using unexpected materials to do the binding. The techniques are very painstaking and really, really fiddly. You do need quite a lot of patience to do it, but once you get into a rhythm, it's a little bit like knitting, you can lose yourself in the process. I think it's incredibly important that we appreciate that things take a long time to make. The length of time, the process, those materials, they grew, they flowered, they finished their practical life on a tree, and now I'm incorporating them into something new, and that's going to take time as well. I like the fact that it's laborious and slow. I've been experimenting, trying to find where my work will fit in, to be kind of recognised for appreciating just what's on my doorstep, realising there's lots of other people out there as well who value what's in their immediate surroundings for different reasons. But by going back over and over again to the same environment, it's just a massive resource. It just keeps giving all the time. And maybe not just the landscape, but the people in that landscape too. People put things on my doorstep quite regularly now. It's taken a couple of years to build up to that, but once people begin to realise what you're looking for, they'll just leave you little offerings on the doorstep. I think the meaning is really about holding up the detail of nature to be admired. It's like we don't really look closely at nature very often, but when you do and take the time out, it's just incredibly good for you and makes you feel great.